here at the Grow Cafe that Progressive Network has put together, and Becky and Brett have done a great job. We love this building, and we're so fortunate to be able to rent this space. So tonight, Carolina Peace Resource Center is bringing you a talk from the famous, infamous Tom Clements. I've known him, I think we deduced that I met him in 1989. Do we need to get some of those pictures up? So those first pictures, you guys. Anyway, Tom.
There you go.
Okay. There we go. So I met Tom in 1989. I do know that he studied forestry at the University of Georgia in Athens. And he was a coal inspector for mountaintop removal, which I have heard stories about how he almost lost his life a couple times. People didn't like what he was doing. That was in 79 to 81. Then he was a carpenter, 81 to 86 in Athens. I'm not sure I would hire him to build my house, but anyway.
Give me a break here.
But he is an expert on all things nuclear. Okay, well, in case you need a new job, Tom. Okay, so he was in the Peace Corps from 86 to 88 in Costa Rica. Okay, in Costa Rica. And then he joined Greenpeace in 89 through 2006. And that's when I met Tom. Should we go to the next? Well, this is one of the actions when Tom was in Greenpeace, and we were fighting a new production reactor where they were going to make tritium, which is a trigger for nuclear bombs, and also potentially make new plutonium. And Tom labeled it a pork barrel project, and a bunch of piggies showed up. We even went into the governor's office, oinking and squealing. It was fun. We were on TV, and we actually won that. But Tom was our leader, our fearless leader. Is there another slide? Oh, here we are. Oink if you love radiation. Okay.
Is that you?
Yes, that actually is me, and I made that sign. Let's see the next slide. So Tom worked with Greenpeace on, I know he's been to Chernobyl, he's been to Russia, he's been to so many international nuclear sites when we're talking about nuclear weapons. But Tom has also been very proponent. He's been fighting hard against the whole nuclear energy industry. And I worked hard with him on that recent fiasco where Santee Cooper and SE&G, now Dominion, flushed $9 billion down the toilet on our reactors. On reactors we didn't need, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So then Tom, I remember he went to Colombia. Am I saying that right? Colombia, South America. He went to Bogota as part of Peace Brigade International as a watchdog. Well, Tom can tell you more about that. But we were communicating, and then he said he made a wrong turn, and he ended up in this Columbia from the other Columbia, and this is where he started working for Savannah River Site Watch. He left Greenpeace in 2008, but he was working with Friends of the Earth and Savannah River Site Watch, where many of us worked tirelessly against the nuclear industry, which spent, the utilities control our state governments, and they have a lot to do with our national government too, but they do, and something everybody needs to learn. Here's Tom. This was our reactor that he drove around. We would have meltdowns with that. He'll tell you how that worked. This is in Aiken. And y'all recognize this guy right here? That's David from CPRC.
David Matos.
David Matos.
20 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. So Tom's kind of been, there's just a few people in the country that have really been working nonstop around the clock on trying to stop the next wave of nuclear weapons they want to build. It's kind of it is a money laundering scheme. Tom's calls it the real conspiracy theories that nobody knows about. So he's going to come up here and try to enlighten us and correct me on anything that I said wrong. And here he is, Mr. Tom Clements.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming, and I'm going to talk. It's all roads are going to lead to Savannah River Site. So I've got some introduction about nuclear weapons that are being developed, a little bit about the costs. It's kind of technical. I'm going to try to run through these slides. If there's some pressing question, ask me along the way and tell me what the time is, because I don't want to bore you or take too long, but if you could go to the,
Tell you.
do I just tell you when to go to? Yeah, the next one. So I call this profiteering off secret nuclear war planning. And part of the secret is, how many of you know what's going on out at Savannah River Site?
Well, I do for what you.
I know a few of you do.
Yeah.
And this reflects on the state of civic engagement in the state of the media. There's a total news blackout on what's going on with Savannah River Site. The only quote media, and you got to put it in quotes, that covers Savannah River Site on an ongoing basis is the Aiken, South Carolina paper, which is right near the Savannah River Site. It's called the Aiken Standard. I call it the Aiken Substandard because the Substandard only reprints Department of Energy and contractor news releases. Otherwise, there ain't nobody covering it. There's a few of, the new and growing non-mainstream media that are covering things. But anyway, Savannah River Site, you can see it's located near Aiken, South Carolina and Augusta, Georgia. I actually used to live right here on the Georgia side when I was a kid, and I found out there was a bomb plant across there later, and it really impacted me. I think that's part of the reason I'm working on this next one. Oh, I call it the real deep state. I get so pissed off when I hear people throwing out conspiracy theories just to cause chaos and hate. This is a conspiracy reality. That's the kind of thing I want to focus on, is the real things that need addressing, not some made up fantasy that some people get hooked into. And that's kind of a joke, the real deep state. This is the real deep state. It's not the political deep state that Trump talks about. These people are ingrained in the Department of Energy and making decisions on their own and spending our money. Next. So this is from 2021, but as you know, there's discretionary spending of the federal government, and there's stuff that's mandatory, which like Medicare and Social Security. So on the discretionary side, I think now it's just taken over where it's more than 50% of the discretionary money is going to the Department of Defense. And you can see here, energy and environment, that includes the Department of Energy, and we'll talk about that more next. So this is from 2023. So $916 billion for the Pentagon is way more than everybody else is spending on military spending. And that $916 billion is really not accurate because there's a slush fund called Overseas Contingency Operations. It's been up to 14% additional that goes to the Pentagon. All the money that's gone to Israel and the Ukraine war, that is a part, because those are special appropriations by Congress that are not part of that red, that's the base appropriation for the Department of Energy. Next. So I want to identify some of the cost in that $800 trillion now, basically, and how it relates to us here in South Carolina and the Savannah River Site. And I'm going to hammer home success equals failure. That's the goal of a Pentagon or a Department of Energy contractor. You want your project to fail because you know it's going to continue to be funded. They're not going to pull the plug on these big military spending projects. So if you fail, meaning if the schedule blows apart for whatever you're doing and there's cost overruns, that's a good thing because it's going to continue. The funding for it is going to continue. So you can see on this one, Lockheed Martin, and I'm going to mention them again, $1.7 trillion for the F-35 fighter. They've already built, 500 or more of them. They're going to build thousands of these things, and they cost like 80 million or plus each. Huge amount of money. So 80% over budget, that's a success in the contractor's eyes. Next slide. So here's another one. They want to build 12 new submarines to replace the Trident submarines, the Ohio submarines that are based off behind Cumberland Island, Georgia, down near St. Mary's, if you know where that is, on the Georgia coast. Those are nuclear-armed submarines, and they want to replace them all. $132 billion for those submarines. And the warhead on them, on top of the missile, would be made at Savannah River Site. That's the heart of the weapon, is the plutonium core of the weapon, and I'll talk about it more. And they haven't started making it here, but that's a proposal. Next. So that W-93 warhead and the missile under the Mutual Defense Agreement with the United Kingdom, they send components to the United Kingdom and basically plans for nuclear weapons. So the United States is proliferating nuclear weapons, and they point the finger at other people for proliferating, but it's legal for the United States to do it. And the Brits are getting a good deal out of this. Next. So there's another missile that's called a Sentinel, and this would use what's called a W-87 warhead. It's a different warhead design, but they all use the plutonium core, which is designed by Lawrence Livermore National Lab in California, and I'll have a map here in a second. And the pits would be made initially at Los Alamos and then Savannah River Site. $141 billion just for the missile, not the warhead. That's the Department of Energy. 81% over budget. That automatically requires the Department of the Pentagon to review the cost and for Congress to review the cost. They've basically given it a rubber stamp. The sky's the limit for this stuff. It's all about the money. Next. So the Sentinel is made by a company called Northrop Grumman, and they're based in Utah. And a reporter who's based in Atlanta has done a lot of good research into what Northrop Grumman is doing. That's where she was standing outside the fence at the facility in Utah. So this new missile, it's an intercontinental ballistic missile. Next. Oh, I put this in here. Look how happy these people are. They're the board members of Northrop Grumman. They know success is failure. They're going to make a lot more money if this is behind schedule and over cost. It's a beautiful thing. It's beautiful. We like this. Go. Next one, please. So they're 400 intercontinental ballistic missile based in the upper Midwest. The red is where they're active fields of warheads. The black is where there used to be, and there's some kind of ICBM national monument that you can go to if you go out that way, which I should do that. But the red ones, they're going to replace all the 400 missiles that are in those warheads. And I've got on here, it's a first strike weapon or a nuclear sponge. And that means you better shoot them off, which to use them first, or they're going to absorb nuclear missiles coming from Russia if you don't shoot them quickly. So there's an incentive to start nuclear war because you don't want to lose your warheads. The whole thing should be abolished. It's totally obsolete. Anyway, that's where the Sentinel with the warhead from Savannah River Site with the plutonium from Savannah River Site would be based. Next. So there are over 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world today. These numbers for Russia and the United States, there's actually about half that many are fully deployed and can be used. And you can see on here, Israel, this is from the Federation of American Scientists this year, 90, Pakistan and India, and North Korea. They're not part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, though Russia, US, and France are part of the treaty. That Chinese number, they're aiming to have 1,500 nuclear weapons. The Russian number is going to go up. This says the US weapon number is going down, but qualitatively, 6 new nuclear warheads in the queue for the United States. So the United States likes to blame all the problems on Russia and China, but they're basically leading the way in a new nuclear arms race. Next. So in the United States, they've got their nuclear bombs for aircraft based in 5 other countries. And we all know with the Ukraine situation, Belarus now, Putin has probably moved nuclear weapons into Belarus. But who's the one, again, leading the way with nuclear weapons in Europe? It's the United States. And of course, France and Britain already have nuclear weapons of their own. Next. And there's protest movement in those countries to get them out of there, which should be done. Does anybody recognize this? This is Dimona, the nuclear reactor in Israel where their plutonium was produced for their nuclear weapons. But several hundred kilos of highly enriched uranium was basically diverted from the United States to Israel because the weapons use highly enriched uranium, weapons grade materials, and plutonium. That's south of Tel Aviv a good way. And I thought when the Iranians were firing missiles, they might shoot one there. If that had happened, that would probably cause the Israelis to really react. Next. So when a new president comes in, and we're about to get a new one of these, in 2022, Biden basically carbon copied Trump's nuclear posture review. It's their strategy for using nuclear weapons. And I've got it here. It goes through all this rigmarole about deterrence, and we're going to do this and that. And then it basically talks about if that doesn't work, we're going to be ready for what comes next, which could be nuclear war. So you can expect Trump to produce a nuclear posture review up to a year after he's in office. And the way it's looking, they're going to return to nuclear weapons testing out in Nevada, which I protested a lot, and we finally stopped it. Now they want to test all these new designs that they've got, and you can bet China and Russia and other countries are going to follow suit. Next. So I call the Pentagon Department, it's the Department of War. It's the Department of War. And the Department of Energy, they make the nuclear weapons. It's Department of Nuclear Weapons, and most people don't know this. They're in charge of producing the nuclear materials, fabricating all the components for the warhead, making the plutonium and highly enriched uranium that go in the warhead, putting them all together out at Pantex, which I'll show you in a second in Texas, and the dismantling the weapons and disposing of the components or storing the materials. Next. So when you think Department of Energy, think Department of Nuclear Weapons. So in the last couple of years, DOE's nuclear weapons division, called the National Nuclear Security Administration, has become so brazen, they call it an enterprise. U.S. nuclear security enterprise scattered around the United States, including Savannah River Site. It's a business enterprise. Department of Energy employs over 100,000 people, and about 90% of those are contractors. And these logos and stuff are from the contractors. Next slide. So here are the main sites, and I'm going to mention the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico, Rocky Flats, which is closed, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which develops the nuclear weapons. Los Alamos develops nuclear weapons, and they're also going to make this plutonium core. Oak Ridge, they make the hydrogen bomb there, and Savannah River Site. The rest of those facilities are closed, and they're in some state of being cleaned up. Next. So here's Savannah River Site, 310 square miles. It was started by the Atomic Energy Commission in the early 1950s. They had 5 nuclear reactors, triangles, and they produced maybe it's on the next slide, but about 36 metric tons of plutonium. And those reactors are in the center of the site in case there was an accident. There was some distance to the boundary of the facility where the radiation would be contained, or if there was an attack by the Soviets, the fallout would have a little bit of a few miles to fall out. Next. So that those 5 reactors produce 36 metric tons of plutonium and all the tritium gas, which is a radioactive gas that makes the hydrogen bomb. So do the math, 36,000 kilograms divided by 3 kilograms per warhead, the hollow sphere. If you saw the movie Oppenheimer, the trick was, how do you get a hollow sphere to implode to cause a uniform nuclear reaction? So Savannah River Site, and I think it's really only 2 kilograms per warhead. 12,000 nuclear weapons SRS was responsible for at the height of the Cold War. Yeah.
Nuclear weapons that are constructed now are a lot deadlier than the nuclear weapons that Oppenheimer was talking about, right?
Well, in large part because they can target them very precisely with GPS and guidance systems. They're rebuilding all the bombs that were based in Europe. They're putting new tail fins on them so they can guide them right in. So they don't need a huge, massive bomb. They can use a much smaller one because they can target them much more precisely. Next. Okay, the K reactor, sorry, that was our model in the early pictures. That was a model of the K reactor. They wanted to restart that in the early 1990s. That produced plutonium and tritium gas. There's no containment over that reactor. That was for the control rods to go up and down inside the reactor. That building is partially filled with concrete now. No, I'm sorry. That's being used for plutonium storage now. Here's a picture of some of the containers of plutonium stacked to the roof inside the K reactor. There's about 10 metric tons of plutonium in that reactor now. Next.
That 36 metric tons, that was over how much time?
The first reactor started like 1953 and they shut down by 1988. So 30 years or more. And there were some serious reactor accidents. So plutonium-239, that's what you make the core. Half-life 28,000 years. So 10 half-lives before it's not dangerous. And the Savannah River Site processes all the tritium that's essential for all the U.S. nuclear weapons. Next, and that's a tritium canister that goes in the weapon. I've gotten yelled at for showing that photo because since 9/11, all of them have been pulled. But I had some that the Department of Energy gave me, and that's a hunk of plutonium right there, which is not really that radioactive. It's not putting off a strong force. Next. So here's another key facility that's a secret. If you ever been to Congaree National Park on Bluff Road, the Westinghouse fuel plant, they make uranium fuel for commercial nuclear power plants. And when you go by there again, at least turn your eyes, they also make these special rods that are taken to Tennessee Valley Authority reactors to make tritium. And those rods are taken to Savannah River Site. They extract the tritium. It's an unregulated facility making these special tritium rods. And I mean, we had a real time getting information about it, but it's a dual use facility. It's a military facility parading as a commercial facility. Next. So in producing all this stuff, there's a huge amount of high level nuclear waste at Savannah River Site. They produced over the years over 100,000 gallons of high level waste. There's still 35,000. They're in 51 tanks. 8 of them have been closed. They've been putting out this date that the tanks are going to be empty by 2037. And about 2 weeks ago, we found a document that's only a 50% chance that the tanks are going to be empty by then. And they're a real threat to groundwater. These are the tanks. They're down into the groundwater. They generate hydrogen gas. They could actually explode. These are some of the groundwater contamination at the site. They just dump stuff willy-nilly out there. There's like 100 dumping sites out there. The whole thing is a Superfund site. And the liability to clean it up, I think it's more like $130 billion. But the nuclear weapons part of DOE is taking over the site as of October 1st. So they're going to try to cut that environmental liability down and transfer the money to nuclear weapons. Next. So the waste is being taken out of those tanks and it's being glassified, vitrified in these big containers, but there's no place for it to go. So it's all sitting there. They filled maybe 4,500 by now, and they've got about that many to go. Next. So in 2007, the United States had all this plutonium, was going to get rid of it by making a nuclear power fuel out of it for commercial reactors. That did not succeed, and I put a lot of time in fighting that. And we finally won. This is an example that we won. It was terminated in 2017. They spent over $8 billion on that facility. Congress, I mean, some of you may have written letters. They would not investigate what happened. I mean, they wasted so much money. This building, maybe the next slide says, don't go yet, but that's what they want to turn into the new plutonium bomb plant. 400,000 square feet. It's got almost 500 rooms in it. And I call it the plutonium bomb plant. They call it something that sounds nicer. So that's where they want to make the plutonium core of their weapons. And you would think that the media would be writing about this. It's outrageous. Next. So when the MOX project was terminated, they were getting $500 million to $1 billion a year. So pit production fit the bill for the contractors. They could keep the money rolling, guaranteed delays, guaranteed cost overruns. Voila, that's the magic formula that a contractor is after. Next. So here's a cutaway. This is not a real pit, but they cast them somehow, and that's what they're going to be doing. They're hollow. They want to produce 80 of these per year, 50 at Savannah River Site. The pit is right here, and this is the thermonuclear part where the tritium is injected. And all US nuclear weapons are thermonuclear now. But this was not, there's no law that Savannah River Site is going to be this key facility for nuclear weapons. This was people inside DOE making this decision. Let's just call it the deep state. I could give you the names of the deep state who made this decision, and I heard Trump is going to weed them out. I've got the list. I mean, I haven't gotten the phone call yet, though. That's what I'm wondering about. Next. So, as I said, Los Alamos and New Mexico and Savannah River Site. The first pits are for that Sentinel missile, and the next one are for that submarine launched ballistic missile. And that's the main one Savannah River Site would make. This is aerial photos from October of the facility. It had probably $1 billion worth of equipment in it for this mixed oxide fuel. They ripped it all out and trashed it all. Gone. No investigation, no nothing. We have no idea what happened to all that equipment. Total abuse of the taxpayer and common sense. But that's what it looked like last month. Next. So the facility that used to make the pits, has anybody ever heard of Rocky Flats? It's near Boulder, Colorado, upwind from Denver. And they were making thousands of them. There were some awful plutonium fires in the ductwork. It dosed houses and people downwind. And we put up, when I worked at Greenpeace, this was 1992. There's me right there. Because we had an inkling then they were going to come back here and try to build a new bomb plant here. And that's exactly what's happened. I hate to say it. All that stuff has been ripped down now. They moved some of the soil. It's contaminated. But it's a National Wildlife Federation now with hiking trails on it. There's been a lot of resistance against that. They're still very active out there. Next. So I'm starting to wind up here. So $2.9 billion in FY25 for Savannah River Site and Los Alamos to begin the process to design the facilities and start making pits. 1.1 billion requested in fiscal year 25. We'll see how much they get for Savannah River Site alone. They originally said that the Savannah River Site bomb plant could cost up to $11 billion. And we were shocked when we saw the budget request that came out in March. It's now up to $25 billion. And it's going to be more because there's not going to be an official cost until at least the end of next year. And like I said, failure equals success. Huge cost overruns, schedule delays. They're hoping it goes beyond $25 billion. And what we have here, and I'm convinced of this, and we've looked into it some, it's the most expensive building in US history. It's a nuclear bomb factory here in South Carolina. Have you read anything in the media about that? No, because there's a news blackout on this. That's part of the secrecy. Next. So let me just read you one quote here. This is from last week when there's a very sympathetic panel on the pit issue. The National Nuclear Security Administration, this is a report from the trade press, should ramp up from its current glacial pace to a wartime footing for building warheads, the pit and the missile. So to compete with Russia and China. So they're not spending enough money and they're not doing this fast enough to develop a new nuclear arms race. And that's who's in control. This right here was a news release put out by the contractor, Savannah River Nuclear Solutions, and the National Nuclear Security Administration. I can't tell the difference between the contractor and DOE. It's always been like that, but it's worse than ever. Next. So Congress, a couple of years ago, they said they wanted a a schedule for cost and plans. That does not exist. They wanted a briefing that describes the environmental impact. Well, they've done some environmental studies, but they haven't done an environmental review of all the Department of Energy sites and all the waste streams and all the risk of plutonium fires. So my group, Savannah River Site Watch, Nuclear Watch New Mexico, and Tri-Valley Cares, we're all aligned together with other groups around DOE sites. We brought a National Environmental Policy Act lawsuit in federal court just right here, a few blocks away, and June of 2021. And by damn, we won it. September 30th, we won a federal lawsuit against these plans for plutonium pit production. So we were just shocked. And the South Carolina Environmental Law Project, if you don't know them, they're one of the best environmental groups in the state of South Carolina. They took the case pro bono. And part of the ruling, and I know I need to shut up here.
No.
Part of the ruling from the judge, I mean, she really let DOE have it. I couldn't believe it. And in here, she said that SCELP should get its costs and fees. So DOE has basically agreed that they're going to get their costs and fees for 3 years worth of work. But now we're negotiating with the Department of Justice, who are the lawyers for the National Nuclear Security Administration, and we're trying to get a programmatic environmental impact statement, which is something that's overarching. It looks at everything, environmental justice, all the waste streams, as I said, the plutonium transport, the risk of fire. So stay tuned. I can't really tell you what's going on, but if we have a programmatic EIS hearing, it'll probably be over in Aiken, and we need to turn out some people to say, we don't like this plan. You can say anything political you want, and also directly about the environmental impact. Next slide, please. So they refused, as I close here, they refused to look at, even on their terms, reusing the old pits. There's 20,000 of them. There's so many from the Cold War. They're stored in bunkers at the Pantex site in Amarillo, Texas. So we found out that they did a report on the aging of the pits. Remember, 28,000 year half-life, they don't age. And there's studies saying they don't age. So my two colleagues who are with the group that brought the lawsuit. So here's what the Department of Energy does under the Freedom of Information Act. I just want to show you. Okay, here's the fun starts. This is not blacked out for security reasons. It's political reasons. That's the kind of stuff we get. So we appeal this, and then the Department of Energy said, oh, we'll take another look at it and see if we can give you more. So that was 6 months ago. So they're going to sit on it as long as they can, because this document probably says they don't need to even make these new plutonium pits. They can use the old ones. So we're going to raise that in the context of this programmatic environmental impact statement and raise it with the judge as we go on. So next. So after they do the new warheads, they want to replace all the plutonium cores of all the nuclear weapons. It's about 4,000 that are either deployed or could be easily deployed. And they're going to blame it all on Russia and China. As I said, the waste stream, this is the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico. That's where transuranic plutonium waste goes. They hadn't even done an environmental assessment of taking all the pit waste into there, and it's going to be a massive volume. And it's highly dangerous. Next. Okay, I close. Stratcom is the one that controls those nuclear missile fields that I mentioned. I was blown away a couple of days ago. They've got a chapel out there. This is some of the glass. They've got like nuclear bombs on the windows of probably a Christian chapel. This is one of the things, I guess it's written on the wall somewhere. We dedicate these windows to their memory, the ones that have worked on nuclear weapons, and ourselves to the ideals which they represented. This is a holy war. Like them, we stand in the light of God, and like them, we pray that we might have resoluteness of purpose and courage of conviction to answer the challenge by saying, here I am, send me, to push the button. I mean, I couldn't believe this. It's the Stratcom facility near, where is it in Nebraska, I think. Anyway, absolutely incredible. Next. So this is an Obama, Trump, Biden plan. Don't be confused. It's not just Trump and it's not just Biden. This has been going, they're going to spend $2 trillion rebuilding the nuclear weapons complex of the Department of Nuclear Weapons, which is DOE, and building those new missiles that I pointed out. And they're planning for full-scale nuclear war, which is clear as a bell in the nuclear posture review. And if Trump starts nuclear weapons testing again, and he's going to be under pressure, it's in Project 2025, we're only getting to the beginning of this now. So how do we stop this? It's very difficult with the state of affairs, and you know how the state of affairs is in Congress right now with Gaza. So we can have a discussion about that. Thanks very much. Next slide. Anyway, that's me.
Just for Tom, are there either information on how Savannah River Site leads the beaches?
Well, that's kind of tough because as you know, Aiken is far inland from the coast. So the Savannah River Site, some people think it's in Savannah, Georgia, but it's not. It's about 125 miles upstream. But there are pockets of radioactive materials in the river all the way down, but because there's less discharge now because the reactors aren't operating, there's actually less radioactive material going into the river. But I think it was 1990, Michael Lau and some of us with Greenpeace, we went all the way down to Savannah and sampled in the Savannah Harbor. And we went out onto Ossabaw Island or something.
Tybee Island,
No, not Tybee, the one directly south,
one right on the.
right by Savannah. And in the sediments, in the river, in the harbor, and in the sediments, basically on the beach where we could find some mucky stuff, we could detect radioactive material. And some of it could have been from fallout. It's hard to decipher without paying a lot of money. But there was impact all the way down the river. Savannah River Site does a yearly environmental review, and they just released that recently. And they basically say things are fine. But in the past, they used to say there were pockets of radiation in the river, and they've kind of stopped doing that. The other thing is they used to release a heck of a lot of tritium gas, which is, it acts like water in the body, and they're still doing that because they process all the tritium. So that's the stuff that comes out in the rainfall and wouldn't go into the river per se. It would go anywhere. And I told you I lived across the river. There was a huge tritium plume when I was a little kid that went right over Waynesboro, Georgia. And I mean, they never told us about it. That kind of stuff, that bad is not happening now, but down on the coast, I don't, there's not a huge amount of radiation down there.
You mentioned something about some of the reactors or those plants like being connected to the groundwater. Is that part of it?
Those high-level waste tanks, there are two clusters of them called farms. And they had two reprocessing buildings, which would take the material from the reactors, dissolve it in acid, remove the plutonium or other stuff. And they pumped the byproduct waste into those 51 tanks. And some of them they're in the water table. I mean, they're like halfway in the water table. And those tanks were designed, they're carbon steel. They were designed for like 50 years. So they started filling them up in the mid-50s. So you can see they're out of date. What they're trying to do is close those first, which means they got to pump it all out and solidify it. And so far, there's not been a major crack down below where the water is. They could leak, but they're in a rush to get them closed now. Thank goodness, by that 2037 date I mentioned, which always keeps slipping. But those tanks also generate hydrogen gas and they can explode. That would be a nightmare scenario because if you get near one of those tanks, you can get a lethal dose of radiation. So if the stuff was spewed around, like happened in Russia, it was worse than Chernobyl, 1957. So I'm really worried about the status of the tanks, and the Department of Health and Environmental Control, now Department of Environmental Services, used to call them the greatest environmental risk in the state of South Carolina. Now they say it's one of the greatest. I don't know if that answered your question.
Anybody else?
Well, let me just, there's some posters up around there. There was stuff before I got involved going on that Brett knows about, and I was involved in a lot of this. But there's a long history of fighting Savannah River Site, and back in the past, everybody knew about it. And I occasionally go up to people and ask them, do you know about Savannah River Site? And it's like, never heard of it. Or if they've heard of it, they think it's closed. It is far from closed. It's more active now than it's been in the last 30 years. So there's a big effort to try to, get public education like it used to be.
It's the largest single site employer in South Carolina since 1951.
About 12,000 work out there. Yeah. Pamela.
A couple of things. Because we have so many boosters at the state level of government for not only nuclear energy, but for Savannah River Site, have you had any successful discussions with any of them about trying to separate the two, and let's just not even worry about Savannah River Site, just focus on the,
Well, the legislature does not have legislative control over Savannah River Site.
no,
The Department of Environmental Services does have to check off on a lot of the cleanup plans going on out there. It's a federal site, so the conservation groups in the state have used that as an excuse where they're not going to work on Savannah River Site, and there ain't no group working on it. Nobody. But it's hard to find a role for the legislature. And they haven't even taken up resolutions in support of Savannah River Site. A couple times they tried, but they didn't really go anywhere. So we've got a real problem that if people are lobbying here in South Carolina, the legislature say, oh, that's not us. You got to talk to the feds. And you know how hard that is. I don't know. What's your thought about it?
just, that's just they have an extremely long amount of time to talk to the nuclear energy committee that they have, the governor's nuclear advisory council, they used to call it. And they'll sit there and listen to all about Savannah River Site and so on, and they have ties to the legislators. So I'm just wondering,
Well, there's a thing called the Nuclear Advisory Council, which
correct.
which is a booster group paid for by the state that advocates for Savannah River Site and the contractors. And they just had a meeting a few weeks ago. The whole thing's a joke. And I think they don't have any real power, but there's about to be an energy bill introduced in January, like last year, and they gave that Nuclear Advisory Council on nuclear energy, basically a decision-making authority. But on Savannah River Site, it's federal, so the feds call the shots on that.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, for our own action, local action can really be more powerful than, going straight to the feds. I'm just wondering, maybe we can.
Well, the
work on that.
Aiken City and County Council are captured.
Sure.
Totally. There are a couple of people over there that raise things with them, but it would take more than a movement of what they're doing. So it's something we can talk about.
Savannah River Keeper doesn't help out at all?
No.
Thank you.
Okay, did anybody else have a question for Tom?
I guess I do. Can you touch a little bit more on the environmental justice components of SRF and the other nuclear sites in the country and how it impacts different groups more?
So the Department of Energy prepared an environmental impact statement about Savannah River Site pit production. It was totally inadequate. So when we brought our lawsuit, environmental justice was part of the concern. And though I wouldn't call them a junior partner, but they're not in on our decision-making with the Department of Justice. But the Gullah Geechee Sea Island Coalition is part of the lawsuit. And they're concerned about that contamination going downriver and potentially what could happen in case of a plutonium accident at the site. So when we get this programmatic environmental impact statement, we're going to need to address the environmental justice impacts. And I can tell you there's an African-American community directly across the river from Savannah River Site. That's right by the nuclear plant Vogtle. They've been totally ignored, marginalized. When they prepared this cursory environmental impact statement, they didn't approach anybody in that community. And when they didn't even mention it in the EIS. And their group, they're part of Women's Action for New Directions, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia WAND. And they are concerned about the impacts to their community. And these are old African-American communities. They got land after the Civil War, crappy land because it's sandy. But that's the kind of people we need to get involved. But it's much easier to see the impacts at Los Alamos. And I've stood on the edge of the mesa, I guess you call it, at Los Alamos. And you look downhill like several miles away and you see community down there. It's one of the pueblos. They're right below, and this where we were standing was just packed with transuranic waste buried. I mean, massive amounts. They just dumped it. So it's a little easier, in my opinion, to make the case that there's a real clear threat to the Pueblo communities, and they are active and involved and will be in this programmatic EIS.
Okay, thank you.
We have one more question from the chat. There's so many movies and TV shows about evil villains trying to detonate nuclear bombs in US cities. Why are our neighbors so blasé about the thousands of nuclear weapons in the hands of people who are actually planning to use them? How can we increase people's sense of urgency for nuclear disarmament? And I think maybe a follow-up to that, or a supplement to that is, have any of the films and the film industries tried to talk about the nuclear armament happening from South Carolina?
I wish I could tell you the names. There's been a lot of films recently. Personally, I don't really watch them because I already know the stuff and I'm already depressed about this. And if I hear that they really uplift and mobilize people, I would watch them more. But there are tools out there. You know, that's a thing to talk about. I think we could, show a couple of these movies here if there was an agreement, and I've been interviewed on some of them, but this is not answering the question. But has anybody heard of the movie The Sum of All Fears? The Sum of All Fears. So this is one of those where the Israelis lost a nuclear weapon in the which war was it? In the 70s, and somebody finds the warhead, and later on in the movie, they're trying to figure out where the plutonium comes from. And I'm sitting there like watching this, and it was all dramatized. And they go, it looks like a CIA job. They stole the plutonium. They're implying they stole the plutonium and gave it to the Israelis. I didn't have to steal it, that's part of the deal. But they're going, where did that plutonium come from? Well, we've run the radioactive signature on it. It came from the third core load of the K reactor at Savannah River Site. And they're going, and then they realize it's a CIA job. Anyway, you should watch Sum of All Fears. It's kind of like, whoa. Anyway.
Sorry, but is there, like, we see what the government is saying here about plutonium bits and whatnot. Is there any talk about what the Israeli government is planning on doing with their nuclear weapons?
Not that I'm hearing. That's been one thing that hadn't really been much discussed in this. During the war. That's why I showed the picture of Dimona. You should look up Mordecai Vanunu. Mordecai Vanunu. He blew the whistle on the Israeli nuclear weapons program. And what happened to him? They kidnapped him in Italy and stuck him in a crate and took him back and put him on trial. But he had already revealed to a physicist friend of mine, he took pictures, what was going on inside the production facility by Dimona. So all of this is pretty much known, but I haven't heard anything. I don't think the Israelis are pursuing new nuclear weapons. They might be, but I don't know.
Do we know where the US is getting the majority of its uranium from nowadays?
It's imported like Namibia. A lot of it's from Russia, but they've just passed a law that without a waiver after maybe next year, they can't import uranium from Russia because they're trying to box off Russia. There's more mining starting to happen in the United States. A lot of it was on Dene, Navajo land. There's massive contamination out there by the Pueblos in New Mexico. But I think Namibia is one place, Africa. Maybe some from Kazakhstan, but the United States depends on imports. Definitely.
So what has been most effective in the past, when you're fighting back against, these, these laws, bills, and like weapons manufacturing efforts in the state? What is needed to effectively like fight back against that, and what has succeeded the most in the past? But yes.
Well, that's what I want you to tell me, actually. So 20 years ago, we used to have a ton of allies in Congress. And we could go and have meetings with the members of Congress. And over the past years, that's dwindled down. We have maybe 5 allies in the House of Representatives now. I mean, it is scary bad. I don't need to tell you things are not good. But just like on Gaza, the whole Israeli thing, we don't have the allies. And how do we rebuild them? Look, I'm 73 years old. I'm tired of doing this. And we need somebody to at least be knowledgeable. That's why I want to talk about it, at least so a few years from now, some seeds are planted. How do we mobilize those members of Congress? They will stand up and go to bat for us. And we're going to be meeting with them. And I don't know if they're going to have any great ideas about how to get new people, but you may think this is a wrong approach. And a lot of you won't remember, but back, I think it was 1985, Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev met and they put out a statement to get rid of nuclear weapons and to disarm. Nothing really ever came of it, but it was a dramatic moment in world history where they did that. So would the guy who just got elected decide he's going to be a statesman and do the right thing on this and Gaza? I mean, it's far-fetched to think about it, but I don't know what other options we have rather than hoping for something crazy to happen that's good. If Trump had, I hate to say his name, if he had an idea that he could go down as a man of history and get rid of nuclear weapons, I think the Russians and Chinese would sit down and talk about it. But that's a hopeful kind of thing. But we're down. John Garamendi from California, he's our main ally. And he does a lot for us in these bills, some of that language, he will do that. But we haven't figured out how to get more people. So we go back to the same ones, but Garamendi's the main one.